Washington, D.C. 1942. The war had already reached America. Pearl Harbor was still fresh in memory. German submarines prowled the Atlantic coast. Radios crackled with rumors of sabotage. In Washington, lights burned late inside government buildings that never slept. Inside the headquarters of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, a file was opened. Not for a spy, not for a bomber, not for a coded transmission. The subject line was stranger. Occult organizations. At the top of the bureau sat a man who believed in order above all else. J. Edgar Hoover. Precise, suspicious, methodical. Hoover did not believe in magic, but he believed in influence. And in wartime, influence could kill. Across America in the early 1940s, strange movements were growing. Men in silver uniforms speaking of divine visions. Prophets claiming secret knowledge from higher beings. Secret gatherings in rented halls. Apocalyptic sermons broadcast over the radio. Some preached spiritual salvation. Others whispered about racial destiny. A few flirted openly with fascism. To most Americans, they were cranks, mystics, harmless eccentrics. To the FBI, they were something else. Closed circles, untraceable loyalties, hidden hierarchies. And in a country at war, anything hidden could be a threat. No one at the Bureau believed they were chasing witches. But the language of the files, coded, cautious, increasingly urgent, suggests something deeper than routine surveillance. It suggests fear. Fear that belief itself could be weaponized. Fear that behind spiritual visions might stand foreign ideology. Fear that America's enemies did not only march in uniform, but gathered in ritual. By 1942, the FBI had begun compiling dossiers on mystics, cult leaders, and esoteric movements across the country. The Bureau was not hunting spells. It was hunting the possibility that faith, myth, and secrecy could become tools of subversion. And once the files began to grow, they did not stop. The Silver Shirts. In 1942, while American boys were boarding troop ships and blackout curtains covered coastal cities, agents of the Federal Bureau of Investigation were compiling a different kind of battlefield map. Not of Europe, of America. The names on the list were not generals or spies. They were mystics. At the center of one growing file was a man who claimed he had briefly died and come back with instructions for the nation. William Dudley Pelley had once been a screenwriter in Hollywood. In 1928, he published an account of what he described as a 7-minute out-of-body experience. He said he had traveled to a higher plane and received divine revelations about America's destiny. He returned convinced that the United States had fallen into moral decay and that only a spiritually purified authoritarian order could save it. 5 years later, in 1933, the same year Adolf Hitler became Chancellor of Germany, Pelley founded the Silver Legion of America. They called themselves the Silver Shirts. They wore metallic gray uniforms with a red L stitched on the chest, L for loyalty. They held rallies, established chapters across multiple states, and published newspapers filled with apocalyptic warnings, anti-Semitic conspiracy theories, and visions of a coming national rebirth. Pelley did not present himself as an ordinary political activist. He spoke as a prophet. He blended Christian mysticism, racial ideology, and authoritarian politics into a single narrative. America had a divine mission, and hidden enemies were preventing it from being fulfilled. To many Americans in the early 1930s, he was a crank. The Great Depression had created space for strange voices. But strange voices sometimes gather crowds. At its height, the Silver Legion claimed tens of thousands of supporters. More conservative FBI estimates placed active membership in the thousands. Still enough to form organized chapters in multiple states, hold public events, and circulate printed propaganda nationwide. What unsettled federal authorities was not just the rhetoric. It was the structure. The Legion had ranks, cells, coordinators, financial networks. It resembled a political movement, but its emotional core was devotional. Members believed they were participating in something sacred, and sacred causes are harder to dismantle than political ones. When war broke out in Europe in 1939, and especially after Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, tolerance for radical movements evaporated. The atmosphere changed overnight. Isolationism became suspect. Fascist sympathies became intolerable. The idea that an American organization might echo themes coming from Berlin was no longer eccentric. It was dangerous. Under Director J. Edgar Hoover, the FBI expanded its surveillance of extremist groups. Files thickened. Informants reported on meetings. Membership lists were cataloged. Publications were examined line by line. The Bureau was not investigating spells or seances. It was investigating loyalty. Pelley had publicly praised aspects of European fascism. He railed against what he called corrupt financial elites. He framed global conflict as a spiritual war. In peacetime, such rhetoric might have lingered at the edges of public debate. In wartime, it looked like sabotage. In 1942, federal prosecutors indicted him. The charges were concrete: sedition and the publication of material intended to obstruct military recruitment and undermine morale. No mystical terminology appeared in the courtroom transcripts. There were no references to visions beyond the grave. But the subtext was clear. The government believed that belief itself could weaken the war effort. In 1943, Pelley was sentenced to 15 years in federal prison. The Silver Legion dissolved into fragments. Uniforms disappeared. Rallies ended. The prophet went silent behind bars. Officially, it was a sedition case. Unofficially, it marked something more subtle. The moment when the United States government treated a mystical political movement as a national security threat during total war. The FBI had not hunted witches. It had hunted a man who claimed divine revelation and built an organized movement around it. And once agents began tracing the connections between spiritual authority, political extremism, and mass persuasion, they noticed something unsettling. Pelley was not alone. Elsewhere in America, other leaders were claiming contact with unseen powers. They were not marching in uniforms. They were not openly praising Hitler. They spoke in softer tones of ascended masters, cosmic guidance, and America's spiritual destiny. They did not look like fascists, which made them harder to categorize. And in wartime, Washington, anything that resisted classification could become a file. The Bureau had learned one lesson from the Silver Shirts. Mystical language could conceal political intent. The next lesson would be stranger, because the next group the FBI scrutinized did not call for authoritarian rule. It claimed to be guided by beings from a higher realm, and insisted that America's future was being decided beyond the visible world. And the government, quietly, was listening. The prophets of Mount Shasta. By the early 1940s, the United States was fighting a global war. But inside hotel ballrooms and rented auditoriums, another kind of message was spreading. It did not speak of armies. It spoke of ascended masters. It did not wear uniforms. It wore white robes. And it did not declare loyalty to Berlin or Rome. It declared loyalty to beings from a higher realm. The movement was known as the I Am activity. Its founder, Guy Ballard, claimed that in 1930, while hiking near Mount Shasta in California, he encountered a supernatural figure, the ascended master Saint-Germain. According to Ballard, this immortal being revealed hidden truths about cosmic energy, spiritual evolution, and America's divine destiny. It sounds theatrical, almost cinematic. But by the mid-1930s, Ballard and his wife Edna had built a nationwide spiritual organization. They held massive gatherings that filled auditoriums with thousands of followers. They published books. They sold literature. They delivered lectures about invisible hierarchies guiding human history. They taught that America had a sacred role in the world, that unseen spiritual forces were shaping global events, that those who aligned themselves with the I Am presence could tap into higher power. And people listened. By some estimates, the movement attracted hundreds of thousands of followers at its peak. Even conservative figures acknowledged tens of thousands of committed adherents across the country. To many Americans, it was simply another metaphysical movement of the 1930s, an era crowded with alternative spiritualities, born from economic despair and social upheaval. But to federal authorities, something else stood out: scale, money, influence. By the time the United States entered World War II, the Ballard's organization had accumulated substantial donations. Their publications circulated widely. Their conventions drew massive crowds, and their rhetoric, while not openly pro-fascist, was steeped in apocalyptic language and warnings about hidden enemies. In wartime, ambiguity becomes dangerous. Under Director J. Edgar Hoover, the Federal Bureau of Investigation had already learned from the Silver Shirts that spiritual movements could drift toward political extremism. The question now was different. Was the I Am activity a religion, or was it a mechanism of influence? Federal investigators began examining the group, not for witchcraft, but for fraud. Prosecutors alleged that the Ballards were soliciting donations under false pretenses by claiming supernatural contact with ascended beings. The case became one of the most unusual federal prosecutions of the era. In 1940, Guy Ballard was indicted on charges of mail fraud. The government argued that his claims of direct communication with immortal masters were knowingly false and used to obtain money from followers. The trial that followed was surreal. Jurors were not asked whether ascended masters existed. They were asked whether Ballard believed they did. It was a subtle but profound distinction. Could the federal government prosecute someone for spiritual claims without placing religion itself on trial? In 1944, the U.S. Supreme Court weighed in on the matter in United States versus Ballard. The court ruled that judges and juries could not determine the truth or falsity of religious doctrines, only whether the defendants sincerely believed them. It was a landmark decision in American religious freedom. But beneath the constitutional arguments lay something darker. The federal government had gone to court over a prophet, not because he plotted sabotage, not because he conspired with foreign agents, but because his influence was vast, opaque, and emotionally powerful during a time of national vulnerability. In the middle of a global war, Washington had found itself entangled with questions that sounded almost medieval. Can belief destabilize a nation? Can faith be weaponized? When does spiritual leadership become manipulation? The FBI's files on the I Am activity did not accuse its members of practicing black magic. They did not describe secret altars or midnight rituals. They described networks, fundraising, mass persuasion. They described a movement capable of mobilizing thousands around invisible authority. And in a country fighting fascism abroad, invisible authority at home felt unsettling. The Silver Shirts had worn uniforms and flirted with authoritarian politics. They were easy to define. The I Am activity was more elusive. It wrapped itself in patriotism. It spoke of spiritual uplift. It avoided overt alignment with enemy powers, which made it harder to label and harder to dismiss. By the mid-1940s, the federal government had prosecuted a mystic and monitored a metaphysical empire. No witches had been burned, no spells had been seized, but a pattern was forming. In wartime America, large movements built around unseen forces, whether divine visions or ascended masters, drew federal scrutiny not because they were supernatural, but because they commanded loyalty that could not be easily measured. And if loyalty can be redirected, even slightly, during total war, it becomes a matter of national security. The Bureau had confronted fascist mysticism. It had challenged prophetic authority. What it would soon begin to explore next was even more unsettling. Not the influence of belief, but the possibility of controlling it. The invisible weapon. By 1943, The FBI had learned two uncomfortable truths. Mystical movements could mobilize thousands. Belief could create loyalty beyond politics. But another question was beginning to surface inside Washington. One that did not involve cult leaders or prophets. If belief is powerful, could it be engineered? The war had forced the United States to confront not only armies, but psychology. German propaganda flooded Europe. Japanese imperial ideology fused emperor worship with national destiny. Everywhere, governments were manipulating emotion, fear, faith. Inside the Office of Strategic Services, the wartime intelligence agency that would later evolve into the CIA, analysts studied morale as seriously as ammunition. They examined how rumors spread, how symbols influenced crowds, how suggestion altered behavior. And somewhere in that quiet analysis lay a dangerous curiosity. What if influence could move beyond speeches and posters? What if the human mind itself could be shaped? It did not begin as science fiction. It began as practicality. Interrogators wanted better techniques. Military psychologists studied stress responses. Researchers experimented with hypnosis, not as stage entertainment, but as a tool for extracting information or strengthening resilience. The war justified experimentation. The boundaries were flexible. Documents from the 1940s reveal growing American interest in psychological operations, psy-war, as a formal discipline. Leaflets were dropped behind enemy lines. Fake broadcasts mimicked German radio frequencies. Carefully crafted messages aimed to fracture morale from within. No occult rituals. No secret pentagrams. Just suggestion. And yet suggestion can resemble magic when it works. The FBI, meanwhile, maintained domestic surveillance on radical groups, religious extremists, and ideological movements. It tracked not only what they believed, but how they communicated and recruited. The language in Bureau memoranda was clinical. Influence networks, persuasion techniques, charismatic authority. But the subtext was unmistakable. Influence was contagious. Influence was measurable. Influence could be redirected. After the war ended in 1945, the United States did not relax this line of inquiry. It intensified it. In the emerging Cold War, fear shifted from fascist mystics to communist infiltrators. The anxiety was no longer about silver uniforms or ascended masters. It was about ideological conversion, brainwashing. The term itself sounded mystical. Could a mind be overwritten? Could loyalty be erased? By the early 1950s, that question would crystallize into a classified program known as Project MKUltra. Officially launched in 1953 under the CIA, MKUltra explored methods of mind control, including hypnosis, sensory deprivation, and chemical experimentation. The program became infamous decades later when declassified documents revealed unethical human testing, including the administration of LSD to unwitting subjects. MKUltra did not originate in wartime occult circles, but its intellectual ancestry can be traced back to World War II, to the moment American intelligence agencies recognized that belief, perception, and mental vulnerability were strategic terrain. The war had normalized the idea that psychological manipulation was a weapon, and once that idea was accepted, the next step seemed almost logical. If the enemy can manipulate belief, we must learn to do it better. The FBI's earlier encounters with mystically infused movements had revealed how easily people could organize around unseen authority. The OSS had demonstrated that suggestion could destabilize morale. Post-war intelligence agencies concluded that the mind itself might be the ultimate battlefield. The irony was subtle. In the early 1940s, federal agents had worried about prophets claiming contact with invisible forces. A decade later, government scientists were experimenting with invisible forces of their own: chemicals, isolation, psychological stress, attempting to alter perception and behavior. The language changed. The methods were modern, But the underlying fear remained the same. Control the mind, and you control the nation. There were no witches in the laboratory, no robes in the interrogation rooms, yet the ambition was ancient, to reach into another human being and reshape what they believe. By the time the public learned about MKUltra in the 1970s, the damage was already done. Files had been destroyed, records were incomplete. The full scope of experimentation remains uncertain to this day, which leaves an uncomfortable space between documented fact and unanswered question. World War II did not produce occult rituals inside federal buildings, but it did produce a climate where the manipulation of belief became not only acceptable, but necessary. And once governments accept that belief can be weaponized, the distance between paranoia and policy becomes very small. The FBI began the war watching prophets. By the end of the next decade, America was experimenting with the architecture of the human mind itself. The witches were never supernatural. They were the idea that influence could move invisibly through society. And in wartime, invisible things are often the most feared. The swastika in Madison Square Garden. On February 20th, 1939, 2 years before Pearl Harbor, 20,000 Americans gathered inside Madison Square Garden. They stood beneath a 30-foot portrait of George Washington. On either side of the first president hung enormous swastikas. It was not Berlin. It was New York City. The rally was organized by the German American Bund, a pro-Nazi organization operating openly on American soil. The Bund insisted it was patriotic. Its leaders claimed they supported true Americanism. They wrapped their message in the U.S. flag. They praised Washington. They denounced communism. They framed themselves as defenders of the Constitution. But the imagery told another story. Uniformed members saluted in unison. Speakers praised Adolf Hitler as a man who had restored national pride. Children attended summer camps where they drilled in paramilitary fashion. The symbolism blended American iconography with the aesthetic of the Third Reich. And for federal authorities, symbolism mattered, because symbols create allegiance. The FBI had been watching the Bund for years. Under J. Edgar Hoover, agents infiltrated meetings, recorded speeches, and mapped local chapters. Informants attended gatherings and documented rhetoric that increasingly mirrored German state propaganda. The Bureau did not open its files because members claimed mystical visions. It opened them because ideology can spread like faith. The Bund's leader, Fritz Kuhn, styled himself as an American Führer. He delivered speeches laced with conspiracy theories and racial paranoia. He accused the Roosevelt administration of betrayal. He hinted that global events were guided by hidden forces corrupting the nation from within. The language was political, but it carried the tone of revelation. A fallen America, secret enemies, a coming reckoning. To the FBI, the threat was not occult ritual. It was myth-making. The rally at Madison Square Garden shocked the public. Protesters clashed with police outside. Inside, chants echoed beneath the rafters. Newsreels captured the unsettling image. American citizens cheering beneath swastikas, invoking the Founding Fathers while praising a foreign dictator. The question inside Washington was simple. Were these merely extremists exercising free speech? Or were they nodes in a foreign ideological network? By 1941, after the United States entered the war, the ambiguity evaporated. Federal prosecutions followed. Kuhn was convicted on embezzlement charges in 1939, weakening the organization, and later interned during the war. The Bund fractured under pressure. Surveillance intensified. But something had changed. The government had witnessed a mass political rally on American soil that felt, to many observers, like an ideological ritual. Uniforms, chants, salutes, symbols engineered to override individual doubt. No spells were cast, no incantations whispered, yet the emotional choreography resembled something older than politics, a collective act of devotion. During the war, Newspapers amplified stories about Nazi mysticism, tales of runes, secret orders, occult societies inside the SS. Some of these stories were exaggerated. Others were rooted in real ideological symbolism within the Third Reich. What mattered was their psychological effect. If the enemy was guided by dark rituals, then any domestic group echoing that imagery felt more sinister. Fear magnifies patterns. The FBI's concern was not that Bund members were summoning spirits. It was that they were summoning allegiance that bypassed ordinary political debate and attached itself to myth. War sharpened the anxiety. In a climate of sabotage scares and espionage trials, even public rallies could look like rehearsal for something hidden. Agents traced financial flows, tracked correspondence, and examined whether foreign funding influenced domestic activity. The investigation was methodical, but the undercurrent was unmistakable. What if ideology itself behaves like a contagion? What if symbols act like spells? Not supernatural, but psychological. The Bund ultimately collapsed under legal pressure and public backlash. Its leaders were prosecuted, its camps dissolved, its uniforms disappeared from public streets. But the episode left behind a lasting imprint inside federal intelligence culture. It demonstrated how quickly large crowds could organize around a mythic narrative of national rebirth. It revealed how foreign symbolism could be embedded within domestic movements. It showed that mass persuasion does not require secrecy to be powerful. And it reinforced a lesson first glimpsed with the silver shirts. In times of war, myth can feel indistinguishable from subversion. By the mid-1940s, the United States had confronted prophets, fascist mystics, and ideological rallies dressed in patriotic language. Each time, the government responded not to magic, but to influence. Yet, influence has one unsettling quality. It works best when unseen. And if foreign powers could manipulate belief from abroad, the next question was inevitable. Could America do the same? By 1944, American intelligence no longer asked whether belief could be dangerous. It asked how to use it. Inside Washington, the war had evolved beyond tanks and artillery. It had become a contest of narratives. Nazi Germany weaponized myth. The Thousand-Year Reich, racial destiny, sacred symbols embedded into banners and uniforms. Imperial Japan fused emperor worship with national sacrifice. The Allies could not ignore that kind of psychological architecture, so they studied it. Within the Office of Strategic Services, analysts dissected enemy propaganda with almost anthropological precision. They examined how repetition reshaped perception, how symbols bypassed rational argument, how fear and faith intertwined. They asked a quiet question that rarely appeared in official summaries. If myth can mobilize millions, can we build one of our own? This was not occult experimentation. It was systematic psychological warfare. OSS teams designed forged letters intended to sow doubt among German officers. They created fake radio broadcasts that mimicked trusted German stations. They circulated rumors suggesting corruption inside the Nazi hierarchy. They engineered leaflets that appeared authentic, exploiting anxieties already present within enemy ranks. The technique was simple and ruthless. Do not invent belief, amplify it. If German soldiers feared betrayal, feed that fear. If Japanese troops believed in spiritual destiny, distort it. If morale cracked, widen the fracture. It was influence as strategy. On paper, these were operations. On the ground, they were something subtler. Attempts to destabilize reality. A soldier who doubts his commander fights differently. A civilian who mistrusts his government hesitates. A nation that questions its destiny fractures from within. The Americans did not need pentagrams or rituals. They needed printing presses, transmitters, and an understanding of the human mind. Psychological warfare units collaborated with academics, linguists, and behavioral scientists. The line between intelligence officer and social engineer blurred. War created permission for experimentation, not with spirits, but with perception. And the results were unsettling. Rumors spread faster than bombs. Forged documents altered behavior. Carefully planted narratives destabilized confidence. Belief proved malleable. The irony was sharp. Earlier in the war, federal agents had feared that cult leaders and fascist mystics might weaponize faith against the United States. Now, the government itself was refining the mechanics of persuasion. No robes, no candles, just strategy. By 1945, when the war in Europe ended, American intelligence had accumulated an unprecedented body of knowledge about mass influence. It understood how to manipulate morale, how to exploit symbols, how to weaponize uncertainty. Victory did not dissolve that knowledge. It institutionalized it. The wartime success of psychological operations fed directly into post-war intelligence doctrine. The idea that perception could be shaped became foundational. Influence was no longer a side tool. It was a central instrument of power. And once a government accepts that reality can be bent through narrative, it begins to ask more ambitious questions. How deep can influence go? Can suggestion alter not just morale, but memory? Not just opinion, but identity? The path from wartime propaganda to Cold War mind control research was not a leap into madness. It was a gradual shift in scope. First, influence the enemy. Then, influence the population. Then, study the mind itself. By the late 1940s, as Cold War tensions hardened, the United States confronted a new fear: communist brainwashing. The word carried an almost mystical tone, as if ideology could be injected or extracted like a toxin. But behind the rhetoric was something real, an anxiety that minds could be rewritten. And if rewriting belief was possible, someone would try. World War II had not uncovered occult rituals inside federal buildings. It had uncovered something more durable: the realization that faith, myth, and perception are forces as powerful as any weapon. The FBI began the war, worried about prophets and fascists cloaked in symbolism. By the end of it, America had learned how to manufacture symbolism of its own. The witches were never supernatural. They were the invisible mechanics of belief, and once those mechanics were understood, the temptation to control them would prove impossible to ignore. In the end, there were no bonfires, no trials for sorcery, no confiscated grimoires locked in federal vaults. There were only files. Thousands of pages, surveillance reports, transcripts, informant summaries, cataloging movements that blurred the line between faith and power. The Federal Bureau of Investigation did not chase spells. It chased influence. During World War II, America confronted something unsettling. Belief can organize faster than politics. It can mobilize crowds, rewrite loyalties, and turn myth into movement. The Silver Shirts proved that mysticism could cloak authoritarian ambition. The I Am activity showed how spiritual authority could command mass devotion. The German American Bund demonstrated that foreign ideology could dress itself in patriotic language and fill an arena beneath American flags. None of these groups practiced supernatural warfare, but each revealed how powerful invisible ideas can be. And that was enough. Under Edgar Hoover, the Bureau documented networks not because agents feared magic, but because they feared allegiance redirected through myth. Then the war expanded the lesson. The Office of Strategic Services proved that morale could be manipulated. Symbols could destabilize armies. Rumors could fracture command structures. Influence could be engineered. By the time the Cold War arrived, the United States no longer asked whether belief could be weaponized. It asked how far that weapon could go. The emergence of Project MKUltra in the 1950s did not appear from nowhere. It grew from a decade in which perception had already been treated as strategic terrain. Wartime paranoia about cults and subversion evolved into scientific experimentation on consciousness itself. Not occultism, not mysticism, but something equally unsettling. A state willing to test the architecture of the human mind. The irony lingers. America never officially hunted witches, but it learned to fear what witches represent: unseen influence, hidden networks, loyalty that bypasses reason. In 1942, an FBI agent opening a file on an obscure spiritual movement might have believed he was defending democracy from dangerous extremism. He likely was. But he was also participating in a larger shift, one in which the boundaries between faith, persuasion, and national security began to blur. War accelerates everything. It magnifies threat. It compresses nuance. It justifies expansion. And when fear meets secrecy, even rumors can acquire the weight of strategy. So, was there an occult threat in wartime America? The historical record offers no secret cabals casting spells inside government buildings. No hidden covens directing policy from the shadows. What it does show is more complex. Real movements, real prosecutions, real surveillance, real experiments. And beneath all of it, a quiet recognition. The most powerful forces in society are often invisible, not supernatural, psychological. The witch hunt never came, but the fear of unseen influence reshaped American intelligence for decades. In the end, the war against fascism abroad created something subtler at home, a permanent awareness that belief can be contagious, that myth can mobilize, and that controlling perception might be as decisive as controlling territory. No one in Washington called it magic. They called it security. But the question lingers, decades later. When a government begins studying how to shape what people believe, who is casting the spell?